Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Before I introduce the topic for this conversation, I wanted to take a second to note this is episode number 100. Doing this show started in July of 2017 while I was teaching religious studies to high school students in Columbia, Missouri. A year and a half later, here I am at episode 100. This show is a true labor of love. This is the greatest hobby I've ever had. The intrinsic reward and motivation I've received from doing this show is immeasurable. I'm proud of myself that I've stuck with the show and continued to do it despite the challenges of doing it. I do all the booking, communicating, publicity, outlining, studying, recording, editing, and publishing. All things considered, an episode takes anywhere from 8 to 16 hours to complete. I'm grateful to my friend, Derek Strybig, who has soundtracked every episode with his fantastic array of music. I'm also very grateful to the guests. I've had some of my favorite conversations ever on this show, and I'm grateful to every guest who says yes to my email invitation with the subject line, Invitation, Classical Ideas Podcast. If you've taken the time to open that email yourself and accept that invitation, please know how grateful I am to you. If you are a new listener or an old listener, please find me on Twitter at classical_ideas. Find me on Facebook at facebook.com/classicalideaspodcast. You can also follow my travel photos on Instagram at instagram.com/theclassicalideaspodcast. You can write to me at classicalideas@outlook.com. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this podcast among the hundreds of thousands you could be listening to. I'm grateful. Today's guest is Dr. Alicia Batten, and we are discussing the Epistle of James. Alicia Batten is Professor of Religion and Theological Studies at Conrad Grebel University College at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. She is a scholar and specialist of the letter of James, social history of Christian origins and early Christianity, and history of biblical interpretation. Our conversation today ranges from the authorship of James, Quelle, the purpose of the Epistle of James, and what James means today. This conversation was a true delight because the Epistle of James is one of my favorite biblical texts. In preparation for this episode with Dr. Batten, I read some of her intriguing articles, notably The Jesus Tradition in the Letter of James from Review and Expositor, and The Degraded Poor and the Greedy Rich, exploring the language of poverty and wealth in James from The Social Sciences and Biblical Translation, edited by Dietmar Neufeld. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Alicia Batten on episode number 100 of Classical Ideas. Dr. Alicia Batten, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
It's good to be here.
I just want to start by having you give a brief introduction to your academic field of expertise and where you are in the world.
Sure. Great. Well, thanks, Greg. Well, I'm a professor of religious studies and theological studies. I'm located at Conrad Grebel University College, which is affiliated with the University of Waterloo, which is in Waterloo, Ontario. I'm Canadian. Did all my studies in Canada, although I did teach for 10 years in the United States, in Minnesota and Washington State, two wonderful states. And I'm primarily a New Testament scholar. So I work on the letter of James, obviously, that we're going to talk about today. But I teach the New Testament more broadly and other early Christian literature. So I'm very focused on contextual study of the Bible. So I'm interested in understanding how these texts, what kind of culture these texts came from. So what were the social values, the cultural values, what was life like in the first century Mediterranean? So I really think we have to root these texts in the context in which they emerged in order to try to understand them historically. So James is a big focus. I'm interested in social history more generally. So history of dress, actually, questions of gender in the ancient world, questions of ancient economics, and also the history of biblical interpretation. So how has the Bible been interpreted through the ages? That's really interesting to see how people have shifted in the way they've read the Bible over time, because it's dramatically different from age to age. And you see that with James, you see that with all kinds of documents in the Bible. So that's basically it.
Wonderful. That's so cool. I'm always interested in the origins of a guest's interests. So if you look way back in your career, can you tell me about how you became interested in the study of Christianity in general as an academic discipline? Like, what really drew you into the topic and made you make a life out of it?
Right. Well, I mean, I did take I was lucky enough, I went to a small high school, but I was lucky enough that our history teacher one year decided to teach a world religions class, which I took, and I loved it. We studied basically Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. And that opened my world to all these different religious traditions. I do come from a Christian background, so I was raised in a liberal Protestant denomination, and that was not an unhappy experience, but I wouldn't say that I was really into church or anything like that. But I took this high school course, and that caused me to become more interested in religion. And then when I went to university, I went to McGill University for my undergrad, and was not a religious studies major, but I took a few religious studies courses, and I took one in particular called The History of Christian Thought, which I just loved. Like, I had no idea before that you could actually ask these questions of the Christian tradition.
Sure.
And I kind of wondered about things as a kid, like the Bible didn't make a whole lot of sense to me as a kid, but I didn't know if I could ask about it or not. And so I discovered in these classes that, in fact, people make their living asking these questions about the Bible. So that was really exciting. And so I just knew, I was lucky enough to have parents who encouraged education. And so I just knew I had to keep going. So I started out thinking I wanted to study Christian theology because I had read some theologians in my undergrad that I found really interesting, especially on this idea that God could suffer. That was just an interesting idea to me. But as I started taking some theology courses in my MA, I realized I wanted actually to go back to studying the New Testament because I found that sometimes theologians would sort of proof text from the Bible, and I wasn't always sure that the way they were interpreting a text was what it actually meant. Or I just wondered about that sometimes. I'm not saying they're wrong. I just wondered about that, and that led me sort of by fits and starts to end up in New Testament studies. So yeah, it was not a big plan, from the time I was 6 or anything like that. One thing kind of led to another. But yeah, I was just lucky enough to have some good teachers, to take some interesting courses, and to come from a context which encouraged curiosity and education in general.
So now as a professor, you've probably taught so many undergraduate courses and graduate courses. Now, do you get to see students in your undergrad courses having the experience that you had where they're like, whoa, I can ask questions like that?
That's right. Yeah. And that's one of the things that makes teaching so rewarding. Even this week, I had a student, she's actually a math major, but is minoring in religious studies. And so I was talking with her after class, and she was just saying how, after each class, she spends the day thinking about the questions that we're talking about in class. And you're just, oh, this is fantastic. I mean, even if you get some students who may not be into it, You always get some who are, and it's just so wonderful when that happens.
It's so rewarding.
Yeah.
So after that initial interest in studying Christianity arose, take me into the moment where you can pinpoint your origins of being interested into 5 pages of the letter or epistle of James. Like, what is the thing that sucked you into the epistle of James that took you through the next part of your career?
Mm-hmm. Well, during my MA, I wrote a thesis, and the thesis focused on the historical Jesus. So that's where I got a little bit into the study of what we call Q, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later on.
Definitely.
But that's this hypothetical source that may lie behind the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, but not the Gospel of Mark or John. So I did my MA thesis on the historical Jesus and some of the tough sayings of Jesus were some of the so-called anti-family sayings. I was trying to understand them in the context of first century Mediterranean family structures. But then I thought, well, I don't know if I want to do a PhD on the figure of Jesus, because there's a lot of work done on Jesus, obviously. Yeah. And I read James, and James, I think, as we're going to talk about a little bit, there's interesting parallels between the letter of James and some of the teachings of Jesus that you find particularly in Matthew and Luke. So that made it intriguing. Also, James is really unique in the New Testament. It's one of the few documents, if not the only document, that does not reflect on the death and resurrection of Jesus in any kind of explicit way. So that's strange, because that becomes central to the early Christian proclamation. For example, Paul, the Apostle Paul, central to his proclamation is the gospel message of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And yet James is silent on this. James is more interested in the teachings of Jesus, even though he doesn't explicitly attribute them to Jesus. So I wondered what's going on there. And that just made James really interesting to me, because I am very interested in the teachings of Jesus. And so it's just fascinating to see an early Christian document that uses those teachings and yet does not reflect on the death and resurrection. There's nothing about the life of Jesus, nothing about the miracles or anything like that. So I think that it really stands out as this unique document. There's a lot of emphasis on economics, on poverty and wealth. And I'm interested in ancient economics, interested in kind of social justice questions in general. So all of those reasons, I think, led me to want to write about James.
Okay, so we need to talk a little bit about who James was. And there are theories out there about who James was. I've read some people even state definitively who James was. But, you know, reading your work, it's very cautious about identifying James. And if we're speaking historically, I'm curious if you can say what you think we can know for sure about the author of James.
Yeah, I think it's hard to identify who wrote this text. It's attributed to James, and there are multiple Jameses in the New Testament. There is one James, though, who emerges as quite significant in an early church. This is James the Just, or sometimes James the Righteous, thought to have been a brother of Jesus. And he's mentioned by Paul, for example, as one of the pillars of the church. He was killed in the early 60s, but when you look at the letter of James, it says James, a servant or a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. So it is claiming to be a James. And if it's claiming to be James, it probably means that James, because he was the most significant James in the early church. And ancient writers would often claim to be someone who they were not. It's not that uncommon to find what we call pseudonymous writers. That literally means false author, but you do find ancient writers doing this quite often. So that would give the letter a lot more legitimacy, a lot more clout, if it was associated with this particular figure in the early church. And certainly there are scholars today who think he did indeed write it. So it's a big item of debate. I don't know that we can know. I think it's probably written later than, than this particular James actually lived. But it's written by someone who's clearly literate, someone who knew Greek, was a Hellenistic figure, probably a Jew. The syntax of the letter is not all that complex, and yet it uses very interesting and sometimes very rare vocabulary. So it's like it's writing, and it draws on ancient rhetoric as well. There's debate about how it's structured overall rhetorically, but you do see certain rhetorical patterns in the letter. So it's obviously from an educated person. Where that person was is not clear, but I think it's probably an urban context. I think the author's writing for a literate, urban, perhaps a mixed audience of mixed social status, but certainly people who could share their wealth, because he is exhorting them to share their wealth with other people. But I think it's hard to define, it's hard to say definitively just who that person was.
Is it reasonable to suggest that the author of James knew Jesus personally?
I doubt it. I think it's probably written a little later, after the death of Jesus. So there are scholars who would say, yes, this author, it was the brother of Jesus. He did know Jesus, but I doubt it.
Okay, cool. Have you, in the last couple of years, I've seen, the popularity and citation of James floating around on the internet a lot. Have you seen the popularity and citing of James changing at all in the last couple of years?
I think it's increasing. That may, in part, just be because it had been ignored for many centuries, relatively ignored at least. You may know that Martin Luther did not like the letter of James very much. He called it an epistle of straw. Not all the reformers disliked James, but Luther didn't. And so much of New Testament scholarship comes out of the German tradition. I think Luther had a huge impact on the interpretation of James. But in the Calvinist tradition, for example, Calvin liked James, used James. I've done a little bit of work on the early Anabaptists, that is the predecessors to the Mennonites and the Amish and so forth, and they certainly liked and used James, so it wasn't universally rejected at the Reformation. But I think in part, relative to Paul and the study of the Gospels, it hadn't been studied as much, so now it is. I think there's been progress made in terms of studying the rhetoric of the letter and the structure, and there's more appreciation for the literary skill that's gone into creating this letter. So that's possibly led to the increase in interest in this letter. More work on this relationship between the letter of James and the Jesus tradition. I mean, that's always been noticed in the history of interpretation. That's not new that people see parallels there, but there's been more research done on, how exactly is he citing Jesus, or why does he not refer explicitly to Jesus? I think more work has gone into that. And so that, I think, in turn has led to the increase in the study of James.
Interesting. Okay, so earlier you talked about Q, and Q is something that I've never really talked about on this show, but it means quelle or source.
Right.
And so you say in an article that I read of yours that it's a lost but reconstructed source that Matthew and Luke's authors used, but that which were not used in Mark and John. So what can we know about this source Q, and what do you think that James gleaned from Q? Right.
Well, scholars have reconstructed Q. There was actually something called the International Q Project.
Oh, neat.
That has produced many publications on what they think Q looked like. Many think it was a written source in Greek that itself may have gone through multiple redactions or editorial stages, but it would have consisted primarily of sayings or teachings of Jesus, so very little narrative. The temptation story, for example, might have become part of a certain stage of the Q tradition, but overall it's mostly teachings of Jesus, so parts of the Sermon on the Mount, For example, there's thought to have been a Q sermon that perhaps Matthew and Luke both used. So it's not a narrative, it's a saying source, and that would not be so weird in the ancient world. We do have ancient wisdom collections from a variety of cultures where the sayings of a wise teacher are preserved. So it's just so-and-so said, so-and-so said, so-and-so said. And for example, in the Christian tradition, there is a text called the Gospel of Thomas that does exist. It was written in Greek and then translated into Coptic, and they have found the Coptic version. They found that in 1945 in Nag Hammadi in Egypt. So that's a legitimate source. In fact, some of the teachings of Jesus in that source parallel some of the teachings in Q, but it's not thought to have been Q. They're not the same thing. And Thomas also has other things in it that some scholars think may indeed go back to Jesus. So the idea of Q is not strange when you think about genres of literature from the ancient world, but there are some who do not accept the Q hypothesis. That is, when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you notice there is some sort of literary relationship between the two, between the three, because there are word-for-word parallels in the Greek, like somebody's copying from somebody else. But the most common solution is that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, and then they also used another source, Q, but then they each used their own independent tradition, and they call that M and L, basically. Sondergut, it means sort of set apart, tradition set apart. But the most common solution then to the synoptic problem is that Mark and Q are sources for Matthew and Luke, as well as M and L. There have been other solutions put forward, but that two-source theory, sometimes called the four-source theory, is the most common solution.
Okay, and then in the article, you also mentioned that James is likely from a Matthean community.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are some scholars that think James knew Matthew.
Okay.
Dale Allison, he's a great scholar, written a lot on James. He thinks James may be familiar with the Gospel of Matthew. I'm not sure about that because there's a lot in Matthew that is not in James. Obviously, I mean, James is short, so it's obviously it's not a gospel, but James does show familiarity with features of Matthew that are not in Luke. So, for example, the saying about not swearing an oath, for example, that shows up in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, but it's not in Luke. But that does show up in James 5. So it could be that James is familiar with some form of cue that Matthew used. See what I mean? So it's not necessarily the Gospel of Matthew, but some source that Matthew used. So that's what I mean by that. I don't know that James was, I'm not sure if he was familiar with Matthew's Gospel, but he was familiar with some Q Matthew, if you will.
Okay.
Some kind of tradition that Matthew used, because it does reflect some of these details that show up in Matthew but do not show up in Luke. Yeah.
Okay. So I have a friend who's a past guest on this show, and she's a New Testament archaeology scholar from the University of Missouri. Her name's Carrie Duncan.
Okay.
And I was talking to her the other day, and I asked her what would be really useful to audiences to ask you about James. And she suggested that I ask you about the social circumstances in which the letter of James was written. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what was going on in that community, such that the writer felt that it necessary to communicate the particular ideas that we find in James. So I want to know about those first century contexts that you were mentioning earlier.
Right. It is tricky because, these ancient writers don't tell us where they're writing or when they're writing or who he just says he's writing to the 12 tribes in the dispersion or the diaspora. So he doesn't say where they are. And there's debate about, is that literally, should you take that literally, or is that more a metaphorical kind of reference? So we don't know where they are. So it's hard to say much about specifics, but given the content of the letter, I think, as I said before, he's writing to an urban audience. I think some of the imagery in the letter reflects a very urban context that only urbanites would be much more familiar with. They seem to have a Jewish orientation. He doesn't get into debates about the law and so forth that Paul gets into with various Gentile congregations. So it could be it could be also people of mixed social levels. He's very critical of wealth. He's critical of the rich. He wants the community not to show favoritism to the rich. So in chapter 2, he's a lot of emphasis on, caring for the poor. He condemns them for offering the best seat, for example, to the rich man who's flashing his gold rings. So I think he's getting at that ancient context of patronage, whereby people had to honor their patron in order to receive benefits in return. And James is critiquing that somewhat. He's writing, I think, for probably a fairly literate community. That is, he's using, as I mentioned before, interesting vocabulary in places that almost sounds like he's trying to impress them, with his vocabulary. And some argue, and I think this is an interesting idea, that he may be writing to a community that is comprised of both Jews and Christian Jews. And this might help us understand why he does not cite Jesus directly, because that wouldn't mean anything to the Jewish members of the community, but the Christian Jewish members might recognize, oh, that's what Jesus taught. Isn't that interesting how in this letter we see how James is now adapting that teaching of Jesus to suit our circumstances. So they would appreciate it. But he doesn't cite Jesus. He doesn't talk about the death and resurrection. He doesn't talk about all things that were distinctive to the Christian message, because he knows there are Jews in that congregation as well, and he doesn't want to alienate them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And he sees himself as a teacher that you mentioned, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So why? So 1.1 refers to Jesus and 2.1 refers to Jesus. Yeah. Is 1.1 actually a part of the letter, or was that something that was tacked on later?
No, most people think 1.1 is part of the letter, but chapter 2, verse 1, some think is a later addition, what you call an interpolation. There's a tricky text critical issue there. It's a very awkward phrasing in the Greek. And so some scholars through history, and this is not a new thing, think that was maybe a later addition to the letter. There were scholars in the 19th century who actually thought this was a Jewish document, and they would say that the first reference to Jesus may also have been an addition. But that hypothesis has never gained a lot of traction. But it does otherwise sound like a very Jewish text.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to dive into a few specifics in the text now. James is quite stark in his views of socioeconomic status, which you mentioned earlier, and who will have access to the kingdom of heaven. But I also want to talk a little bit about your specialty in first century economics. So what do people in 2019 reading James need to know about the economics in antiquity before we, haphazardly apply James's arguments today?
Well, one of the things that many historians would argue about economics in antiquity is that they did not have this notion of everything getting bigger the way we sometimes hear in modern contexts. The the growth of the economy is growing and so
Yeah.
forth. There is this anthropological notion of limited good, and that means that if I gain, you're losing. There's only so many goods to go around, whether that's honor or land or money or food or whatever, what have you. Not this idea that everybody can gain. So that's one thing I think that's important to remember. There were the number of elites in the ancient world was small. Most people were at the bottom. So most people are scrambling to get enough to eat each day. So the concept of a day laborer or poor farmers, or, the Bible talks a lot about widows and orphans who really were destitute often. So most people were poor. You did have what we call the retainer class, so people who worked for the wealthy. You might call them sort of middling groups, if you will, but not a notion of a sort of a vast middle class the way we think of that today. So a different kind of structure. And the economy, many people think of it as being embedded with everything else. So with politics, with religion, with family kinship structures, there wasn't sort of this separate field called the economy, which you could analyze mathematically. I mean, not that there weren't things like perhaps inflation, and there was certainly money and a pretty elaborate trade system, but I don't think we can just plunk, contemporary notions of economics onto the first century.
Okay, I understand. So you have this article that I read, "The Degraded Poor and the Greedy Rich: Exploring the Language of Poverty and Wealth in James."
Right.
And in chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, you have this section where you write about the degraded poor. So what does the degraded poor look like to James in the writings?
Well, when I use the word degraded, it means, in a sense, dishonored. And I think the honor and shame were very important cultural values in the ancient world. And generally, the poor were associated with shame. It was easy to slide down the social scale in the ancient world. It was much more difficult to move up. And I think you can separate these honor, shame, cultural values from things like class in the ancient world. But I think by translating it as degraded poor and greedy rich, James is trying to get at this idea that, say, for example, you treat the wealthy with partiality, you're in fact dishonoring the poor. In fact, he says that in chapter 2. So by showing more favoritism to the rich, he's trying to preserve, in a sense, the honor, or in effect, James is saying that you're in fact dishonoring the poor, and he's concerned to maintain the honor of the poor. So in chapters 1, 9 to 11, he actually turns those social values upside down. So he tries to say that it's the rich who will wither away, as he says, but it is the poor who will be uplifted. So in some respects, I think he's going against some of the dominant cultural values that existed in his context.
Okay, interesting. So something that I've seen pop up a lot lately is James chapter 2, verse 14, where it talks about faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. I've heard this in rock songs lately, in Twitter feeds, and comment sections. Can you talk a little bit about the prevalence and the importance of 2:14? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that particular verse.
Right. Well, some would identify the central theme of James. There's a scholar named Patrick Harton who's written a lot about this. He would say the central theme of James is integrity or wholeness. And so the idea of faith and works going together, that is, you have to walk the talk. That would reflect that central theme of wholeness. So it's not just about faith or trust. Here I'm thinking about faith as this notion of trust, but it's also how you act on that trust. So you can't separate those two things. You can't just rely on faith, for example. Now, this verse has been very famous because, this led in part to Martin Luther not liking James very much because of his emphasis on faith, justification by faith. So he didn't like James because this seems to go against that central teaching.
Interesting.
And some wonder, again, all these questions are debated, but some wonder, is James in fact reacting to a form of Paulinism, that is a particular interpretation of Paul, which is emphasizing faith at the expense of works. And so maybe that's part of the reason he's stressing this so much, that you have to follow through with works. It's not only about faith.
Okay, so it seems. Do you think that James sees the rich as lacking in works?
Well, certainly in chapter 5, when he really lets loose on the rich, he says, "Come now, you rich, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you." He critiques the fact that they have all this wealth that's rotting. It's a very uncomplimentary picture. It's very unflattering. I think it's invective. Okay, he's really.
I love that line.
Hitting hard.
Yeah, I read that line today, and I was like, "Whoa, that is wild stuff."
Yeah, and he talks about how they've lived in luxury and pleasure, and then he talks about the farmers and so forth. But he says, they've kept back the wages of the harvesters by fraud. So obviously they're not following through with works because they're exploiting other people.
How do you think the author of James would interpret the ways that Christianity has been used well and less well in modern society? Like, what do you think that James would see as our successes and failures in the centuries since?
Right. Well, he would probably... Here I'm obviously guessing, but
sure.
I think he would critique the wealth of the church and of Christians. I think that would not escape James's pen. The author might be critical of the kind of individualistic notions of religion that exist in the modern day, the notion that it's all about me, or somehow it's about my personal faith. That's the focus here. I mean, I'm not trying to say you wouldn't be very interested in faith, but the kind of individualistic focus that we have in the contemporary world might be something that James would have questions about as well. So yes, I think, and then just all kinds of economic practices that we see with the kind of obsession with the marketplace that we see in our contemporary world. I wonder what James would have to say about that.
Can I ask you a question about teaching, just in your classes in general?
Uh-huh.
What are some things that you think that your undergraduates and graduate students find most surprising in your Bible courses?
It would vary depending on the student, because the students come from a lot of different backgrounds. I think one thing that surprises them or sometimes can be a source of dismay is questions of authorship. That is that some of the texts in the New Testament are maybe not by whom they claim to be by, not only with regard to James, but for example, some of the letters attributed to Paul. I think that is probably a big one. We do spend some time talking about the historical Jesus. That can sometimes be controversial. So the idea that everything in the Gospels, for example, all the miracles and teachings that are associated with Jesus, many scholars question whether or not Jesus actually said all those things or did all those things. The idea that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts, for example, if students come out of a context in which that has been taught to them all their lives, it's very difficult for them then to think about it in a different way. So I try to be very sympathetic given the different contexts and backgrounds that the students come from.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So a few of the pieces of yours that I read come from 2008 and 2011, and I'm curious if you can tell me about the future of the field. what are some of the major questions that scholars such as you and your colleagues that you've mentioned, what are you still exploring in future research on the Epistle of James?
Yeah, well, I'm still interested in questions of economics. So I'm going to be engaging in some work I'm particularly interested in ancient Egypt right now and the city of Alexandria. So just looking at labor relations, economic practices, taxation practices. I'm not sure if James is from Alexandria, but I'm just interested in looking at possible connections there. So I think more work on James and the economy will be coming forth. There's more work being done on the history of the reception or the history of interpretation of James. I think that's very important. Connections between James and ancient philosophy. So, for example, many scholars have seen parallels between James and certain Stoic teachings, the idea of care for the soul and so forth that you find in ancient Stoicism. People are exploring with connection to James. James has some apocalyptic tendencies, so looking at James in light of apocalyptic imagery, I think is continues to be of interest, as well as close studies on the actual language and vocabulary of the letter. I think that will continue as well. James's use in the early church.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because in the East, like the Eastern Empire, the first time James shows up is as scripture is in Origen, who's early 3rd century. In the West, it's not till later in Hilary of Poitiers in the 4th century. So how do we account for the gap between, when the letter was first written and then when it's first cited as scripture? How do we understand that? Where there were disputes about authorship of James as well in the early church. So it's not that every early Christian thought that James the Just necessarily wrote this letter. So I think more work in that direction as well. So I think there's lots to be done.
There is a lot to be done.
Yeah.
Well, that is wonderful. To conclude, do you have any things that you think that people should read if they want to use this episode as like a diving off point into future studies? Like, what do you think that people should take the time to look into?
There's a good book. It's been out for some time by a British scholar named Richard Bauckham. I might be pronouncing his name incorrectly, but it's Bauckham, I think it is, on James. It's a commentary, but he compares James's use of Jesus traditions to the book of Proverbs or the book of Sirach, which is what you call a deuterocanonical text, use of Proverbs. And then he thinks about James in the context of the modern day. He also looks at Søren Kierkegaard, who was a Danish philosopher. James was his favorite text, one of his favorite texts. So he looks at its use by Kierkegaard. So that's a kind of an interesting book that I think is accessible to a pretty broad audience that people might be interested in reading about James. If you're really interested in things like liberation theology and so forth, Elsa Thomas has a book that's been out for a while called The Scandalous Message of James, a short book that people might find interesting. So she's looking at James in the context of Latin America. Patrick Harton, I've mentioned before. He's a scholar who's written quite a bit about James, including some more popular kinds of books about James. So those would be three that I'd mention.
And I think that you have some stuff posted on your academia.edu profile, don't you?
Right, yes. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Batten, this has been a really, really fun conversation. I'm so grateful to you for spending some time with me today to talk about your work in the Epistle of James. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for your interest.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.